حي على الفلاح.
The ennobled members of the household of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we've arrived in the series at perhaps what I think, given what I know of this person's history and this person's biography, might be one of the more popular and more exciting installments of the series. Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib radiyallahu an, Asadullah, Sayyid al-Shuhada, the Lion of God. This was the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, his paternal uncle. It's mentioned that Hamza might have been 4 years older than the Prophet ﷺ. So when you read uncle, I think there's a tendency to think someone much older, right? And of course, they were both raised, in the same household, Hamza is kind of a representation of everything traditionally masculine. It's mentioned that he excelled in wrestling and fighting and hunting and was very strong. In reviewing his history, it's mentioned that he was fond of hunting lions. This is Sayyidina Hamza. And, through his strength, Islam was elevated. Through his strength, the Prophet ﷺ was granted protection. But that occurred in a very unlikely way. Once Hamza was coming back from a hunting expedition, and as soon as he entered Mecca, he was told that right now, at this very moment, in the haram, Abu Jahl is insulting your nephew. He's disparaging your nephew, and your nephew is not responding. This is the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So Hamza immediately rushed to the scene, and he, without knowing anything, he wasn't too keen on religion generally, and he certainly wasn't, following the developments of kind of early Islam and the Prophet ﷺ, but just in defense of his nephew. And I want to speak to that. The Prophet ﷺ said in an authentic hadith, to be beloved to people is half of intelligence. The people around the Prophet ﷺ, you see this with Abu Talib, you see this with Hamza, you see this with countless numbers of people who just casually interacted with the Prophet ﷺ even. If you interacted with him, you loved him. If you knew him, you were completely smitten and taken by him. So in the case of Hamza, he didn't know anything about Islam, he didn't really know much about Tawheed, but the very fact that the Prophet ﷺ was being assaulted, that he was being insulted, that he was being disparaged, this was enough to move Hamza in defense of the Prophet ﷺ to go to Abu Jahl, proclaim to him, say to me what you said to my nephew, because I believe as he does. Now do to me what you did to him. And Abu Jahl, of course, Hamza is intimidating, Hamza is, in his presence, Abu Jahl began to cower. And then Hamza took his dir'ah, he took his shield, and he struck Abu Jahl on the top of the head so hard that he actually left a gash, right? He wounded Abu Jahl. And some of the supporters of Abu Jahl, other detractors of the Prophet ﷺ, they rushed to his defense, and he said, no. Abu Umara, which was Hamza's kunya, was actually correct in striking me because I truly did insult his nephew. This was Sayyidina Hamza, and this is the manner in which he accepted Islam. And soon after he accepted Islam, it was two people. Their conversions provided a great deal of comfort and insulation for early Muslims. Sayyidina Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib and Sayyidina Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anhuma. And there's a lesson in that for us. And the Prophet ﷺ, in the case of Umar, he was praying that Allah Ta'ala would strengthen Islam by way of one of the two Umars. Because there was another Umar that was also in Mecca. But when we see people that enjoy great strength or great influence, we shouldn't automatically pit ourselves against them. Rather, it's prophetic to ask that Allah would guide them, so that the truth can be strengthened by your talents, so that the truth can be strengthened by your abilities. And as soon as Sayyidina Hamza became Muslim, The same is said of Sayyidina Umar. Muslims experienced much more security. They enjoyed much more mobility and much more freedom in their expression of their religious faith. Sayyidina Hamza was one of the people who always came to the Prophet ﷺ expressing a desire to defend the physical integrity of the community. And the Prophet ﷺ would simply tell him, Allah has not given me permission yet. And it's interesting, you look at the Prophet ﷺ, and one of the things that makes his example so complete, so consummate, is that he's a perfect example of pacifism, and he's a perfect example of martial engagement. There was 13 years in Mecca where he was completely pacifistic. Allah has not given me idhn to respond, militarily. And then in Medina, he engages in combat, but he does so with a very high standard of ethics. But Hamza would often exhort the Prophet ﷺ, we should defend ourselves. We shouldn't be getting attacked like this. We should defend the integrity of this community. And the Prophet ﷺ would just tell him, wait until Allah gives us permission. After arriving to Madinatul Munawwarah, the Prophet ﷺ was given that permission by God to defend the physical integrity of the community, and thus commenced the Battle of Badr. And at Badr, most of the detractors of the Prophet ﷺ met their ends at Badr. But Utbah in particular was killed at Badr. And Hind bint Utbah's daughter, radiallahu anha, which I'm kind of giving away some of the story by saluting her, she was very aggrieved by the death of her father. And she hired a bondsman who's referred to in the sources as Wahshi. The term Wahshi in the Arabic language, it means uncivilized or uncouth. He was an Abyssinian, bondsman or Abyssinian, servant. So, there's something that doesn't sit exactly well with me about calling him Wahshi, and I think some historical investigation, perhaps this is something I can engage, should go into being able to say his name. But in the sources, he's referred to as Wahshi. Hind bint Utbah, radiallahu anha, she hired Wahshi, radiallahu anhu. She said, the next time the Quraysh meet the Muslims on the battlefield, I don't want you to commence in battle. I don't want you to engage in battle. I just want you to find Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib. Right? So the next time those two forces met at Uhud, Wahshi just carefully probed the battlefield, waiting for an opportunity to strike. And as soon as an opportunity presented itself, he lanced Hamza. And not only that, Hind bint Utbah, radiallahu anha, she went to Hamza, opened his stomach, removed his liver, and bit it. Which sounds particularly gruesome, but I think it speaks to just where she had been taken as a result of rage, as a result of grief. Later on, the man referred to as Wahshi came to the Prophet ﷺ and wanted to accept Islam. Now you must understand, Hamza was the favorite uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. So when he came to the Prophet ﷺ, or he sent word to the Prophet ﷺ, I want to become a member of this community, but I'm worried about feeling welcome, being welcomed into the community, given what I've done. And the Prophet assured him that he has a place in this community. That happened in the past. Islam does away with everything that comes before it, but it's very hard for me to look at you. It's very hard for me to kind of engage you knowing what happened between you and Hamza. And that is a reflection, one, of the humanity of the Prophet ﷺ, two, of his magnanimity, that I forgive you, three, his great love for Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, who he referred to as his favorite uncle, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. If we're talking about Hamza, we could sit literally for hours on end just talking about his manaqib, his virtues, and talking about his distinctions, and telling stories about his great courage and his great valor and his great bravery. But seeing as though we intend these to be short easily digestible vignettes and biographical sketches, perhaps this is a good place to end.